What does the R sound like in the Romance languages? In most Romance languages, they use an alveolar R, which is basically the rolled R as we call it in English. So Italians don't say Rome, they say Roma. And in Spanish, Catalan, Romanian, most dialects of Portuguese, and most other Romance languages, that's exactly the sound that the letter R makes. So what in the world happened with the French R? R, 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 R. Un renard rue de Rome. Un renard rue de Rome. Welcome to Jack of All Languages, the show where I tell fascinating stories about words, languages, and the people who use them. I'm your host, Jack, and today is our very first episode of the show. Today we're going to hear the history of the letter R in the Romance languages. This is a story that involves nobility, prestige, fashion, social change, and linguistic change. Let's start at the beginning. The Romance languages came from Latin, and most scholars agree that the R in Latin was pretty much exactly like the R in modern-day Italian. Roma regit reges, virtus vera est rara. But how do we know it sounded like that? The truth is we don't know for sure how Latin sounded. We have a pretty good idea from sources like poetry, primary sources where authors wrote about Latin grammar, and things like graffiti and spelling mistakes that people often made. Looking at spelling mistakes to me is probably the most fun way to get a glimpse at how Latin was pronounced. Well, maybe fun isn't the word most people would use here. By looking at spelling mistakes that common people made in Latin, we can see how people thought words should be spelled in their language based on how they actually said those words. Think of the way English speakers might misspell the words here and here, or two, and two. I remember one spelling test I had in elementary school where I was supposed to spell the word shore, S-U-R-E, and I wrote S-H-O-R-E, which makes sense, right? Based on the way we pronounce S-U-R-E, you would think it would be spelled with an S-H. Getting back to Latin, there is an ancient work called the Appendix Probi, which is basically just a list of 227 common spelling mistakes in Latin. The list is formatted write X, not Y. Doleus, non dolium. Calida, non calda. Frigida, non fricta. Vinea, non vinia. Tristis, non tristus. This is just one of the texts that gives us some insight into how classical Latin was pronounced. Okay, so assuming the scholars are right, and Latin had an alveolar or trilled R sound, what happened with the later Romance languages that evolved from Latin, like Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, Romanian, Catalan, Romansh, Sardinian, Galician, Occitan? Sorry, there are a lot of Romance languages, but that's the topic for another day. So what happened to the R in most of these languages? Most of them seem to have kept that alveolar trilled R that they had in Latin. There are a few notable exceptions though, including standard Parisian French and certain dialects of Portuguese. Instead of the alveolar R, most French speakers pronounce the letter R with a guttural, uvular sound, like the one you heard me trying to emulate at the start of the video. R, R, R. It's a totally different sound to the alveolar R of Italian, Spanish, and other Romance languages. And a lot of people who learn French as a second language really struggle with learning how to make that sound. So why did the French start pronouncing their R's like that? Again, most scholars agree that Old French and Middle French kept that alveolar R of Latin. It wasn't until the middle of the 17th century that we get some evidence of a uvular R sound in the French language. A group of women called the Précieuses from Montpellier apparently started speaking this way sometime in the middle of the 17th century. Their manner of speaking was described as parler gras, which means literally to talk fat or to lisp. This story is pretty much just an anecdote though. We don't have a ton of evidence that it's true. Later in the 17th century, though, we do get some pretty decent evidence for a uvular R in French. In 1665, a playwright named Raymond Poisson publishes a play called L'après-souper des auberges. In this play, one of the characters doesn't seem to be able to pronounce his R's correctly, or he might be pronouncing his R's the way people around him are starting to pronounce their R's. For example, instead of saying grande and gras, this character says guan and gua. The playwright might have done this for comedic effect, or maybe he's reflecting the speech of the times. By the end of the 17th century or the start of the 18th century, the uvular R was no longer just a novelty feature of certain minority groups of speakers. By this point, it was an accepted feature in the language. This is not to say that all French speakers were using the uvular R, but the uvular R was spreading. How do we know? A strong piece of evidence comes from a Hungarian traveler who visited France just before the French Revolution. This man was named Wolfgang von Kempelen, and he wrote that about a quarter of the population of Paris was using this strange uvular R sound. Of course, this was just an estimate. We can't say for sure that he was exactly right, but it does show that a lot of people are starting to use this uvular R. From this point on, the uvular R starts to gain more and more momentum. During the course of the 19th century, it largely replaces the alveolar R in northern and central France. In the south of France and in some rural regions, the alveolar R is still holding on. But by the time the 20th century rolls around, the uvular R almost completely replaces the alveolar R. Once again, in some southern and rural dialects, you can still hear the alveolar R, but it's pretty uncommon at this point. So now we've got a timeline for the development of the uvular R in France, but we still haven't answered an important question. Why did the French start pronouncing their R's like that? The answer to this question, unfortunately, is that we don't really know. But we have some theories. Probably the answer has something to do with social prestige and/or speech impediments. Let me explain. The social prestige element is pretty easy to understand. Basically, at some point during the 17th century, a group of wealthy, high-class Parisians may have started pronouncing their R's with this guttural uvular sound. Well, it wouldn't have taken too long before a lot of the rest of the city got on board and started pronouncing their R's that way too. It's often said that women, especially young women, are the primary drivers of linguistic change. Well, if that's true, then our story about the précieuses from Montpellier starts to make a little bit of sense, right? These influential, aristocratic, high-class young women may have started pronouncing their R's in this way, with this parler gras. And possibly when people heard these young women talk in this way, they just started to copy them. This kind of thing definitely happens. I mean, just anecdotally, think about how much our language has changed since the internet was created. We don't know for sure that this story of the précieuses from Montpellier has any truth to it. But the important thing to understand is that social class definitely plays a role in linguistic change. Another explanation for the spread of the uvular R is that it started out as a speech impediment. The alveolar or trilled R that they have in Spanish and Italian is pretty difficult to pronounce. Anyone who's taken a Spanish class and has struggled to get that R sound down will understand what I'm talking about. The rolled R is difficult for a lot of people. So this theory holds that the guttural R may have started out as a speech impediment, and soon other people began to adopt this way of speaking, maybe because it was just easier. Whatever it was that got people in France pronouncing the R in the back of their throats, it definitely stuck. And soon, the uvular R became fashionable. It likely spread from city to city throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, as the cosmopolitan elites in each new city heard about this cool new way of speaking that was coming out of Paris. The uvular R spread to the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, possibly Germany, possibly Portugal. A lot of German dialects do have that uvular guttural R sound, but we aren't sure if the Germans got it from the French or if it independently arose in Germany. That is also a topic for another day. And that brings us to the present day, where the French continue to use that lovely guttural R sound, while the more conservative Italians, Spanish, and Romanians continue to use that alveolar R, whether it's a full trill, R, or just a little tap, R. To me, it's amazing to think that just a little over 1,000 years ago, French and Italian were basically just two dialects of the same language, and today they sound so different. If these are the kinds of thoughts you find yourself having, like and subscribe to my brand new channel because I promise there will be so much more content just like this. I've thoroughly enjoyed the process of researching and creating this episode, and I want to thank you so much for making it all the way to the end. In the comments, let me know how the R sound is pronounced in your native language. Or if you're a native English speaker, let me know if you've ever tried learning French, Italian, or Spanish, or any other language, and you've struggled with that R sound. Or maybe phonetics and pronunciation are a breeze for you. Either way, I'd love to hear about your experience. Thanks for watching Jack of All Languages. Until next time, arrivederci and au revoir.